Well, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. It's a delight to be with you, and we're excited to share with you the latest installment of the Global Leadership Forecast series of webcasts. For those of you who've been attending these since we began last year, this is, of course, the flagship report around the best of leadership development around the world. It's a project that DDI has led for many, many years, and we've been privileged to partner with them and with EY on this latest installment. And so every month we have an opportunity to bring to you the highlights from yet a different aspect of the report. It's a great report. I would encourage you to download it and to read it at your leisure. But today we're going to share just one particular piece, and that's around the financial impact of leadership quality. So I am Rebecca Ray. I have the privilege of being the Executive Vice President for Human Capital here at the Conference Board. And just before I introduce my treasured partner, just a couple of housekeeping things. So first of all, thank you to the many, many of you who have chosen to sign in today. And a couple of things. You see a prompt here on the screen. At the end of this, there will be an evaluation. We'll talk about that in a moment. But a couple of things you should know. Like all of our webcasts, we offer you an opportunity to earn continuing education credits. You'll see that there are three types there, HRCI, SHRM, and CPE. For the CPE one, you will need to remain awake and alert in the chair and click a button 3 times during the webcast in order for you to receive credit. So if that's something that you'd like, you do need to put your full name, email address, and the credit type you'd like in the box below in about the center bottom of your screen. If you also could just perhaps welcome my colleague and the lead author on this report, Dr. Evan Sinar, who is the Chief Scientist and Vice President at DDI, and he joins me for this webcast. Welcome, Evan.
Thanks very much, Rebecca. Great to join the group, and always great to work with you again.
Well, thank you. You know, Evan and I, for years, have traveled around the world delivering highlights of this or other reports that we've had the opportunity to work with the folks at DDI, and I've learned a lot from Evan over the years. We couldn't have anyone more analytical in nature or more equipped to talk about the financial impact of the leadership quality than Evan. So thank you very much for joining me, Evan.
Absolutely, my pleasure.
So a little bit about the report for those of you who perhaps are just joining us for the first of the series, and of course all of the earlier ones as well as this one and all future ones will be recorded and available for download and viewing at your leisure. But as I mentioned, this is a long-standing report, and it is among the largest, if not the largest, leadership development study in the world. And so this really gets at, for those of us in the human capital space, the really the best in class approaches to leadership development and also the opportunities for us to learn how the best get better. So a little bit about the research, just very quickly. You can see the breadth and scope of this. And there were more than 25,000 business line leaders who responded. These are the people who are the direct recipients of the programs that we all put together. And you can also see that more than 2,500 HR professionals around the world, representing more than almost 2,500 organizations, responded. So really a good cross-section of us globally who are laboring in this leadership development space. If you start at the top of the dial, you can see the leader levels mirror what you would think with C-suite leaders at the top, and then as you move through frontline leaders and whatnot. So good representation through that. You can see that industry representation is very good. There's also a good mix of people who thought they were high potentials, and I don't think that that's based solely on their mother's assessment of their own performance, but rather hopefully this is an indication that these are people who have been tapped by an organization and told that they have great expectations for them and they need to deliver. It does skew a little bit more one gender than the other, and so that also is a reflection of the dearth of women in leadership ranks, particularly as they move through the leadership pipeline. And I might also add that there's good representation, as you can see here, across different countries and parts of the world. So I think what you're looking at now are the highlights that we're going to share with you from a vast cross-section of folks who are either the recipients of or the designers and deliverers of leadership development. So with that, let me turn this over to Evan to kind of take us through some of the highlights in terms of where we find that quality of leadership makes a demonstrable difference in one element or another, or in one way or another, in which you begin to look at a business performance, particularly from a financial perspective. So, Evan, would you mind taking us through a few slides?
Absolutely. Thanks, Rebecca. And I think you described the foundations of the research very well. And speaking to this particular view of the research, as you mentioned, we've had a long-running set of presentations and this whole webcast series looking at various aspects and key findings and themes from the research. And for this particular webcast, we focused explicitly on the prediction of financial performance at the organizational level. So organizations who have proven themselves to be more financially healthy, both in terms of revenue growth, in terms of profit. What are the specific practices linked to that as a particular outcome as a result of the leadership practices that they have in place? So alongside the data that we gathered from both the leaders and the HR professionals that Rebecca just shared information about, we also gathered hard data about their financial effectiveness as companies. So the publicly traded companies in the sample, we collected data about their revenue, about their earnings, and about the profit. So everything you'll see today is based on what we know from this research in terms of what practices, what actions, what steps organizations are taking that have this financial payoff. So those that are growing profitably, what are they doing differently from their less successful peers? So starting with digital leadership specifically, this is a topic that many organizations are grappling with, many leaders are grappling with, having the requisite skills needed to succeed and excel as a leader who now is faced with new technologies that they have to not only master themselves, but apply back to how they lead others. This also has branches into the adoption of artificial intelligence, new technologies there. This creates immense pressures for many leaders to change the way that they lead, more often remotely or through the use of tools that enable collaboration across groups. It puts pressure on the way that they make use of these tools to lead better, not just distribute work, but actually improve the way work gets done for their employees. It relates to how they gather and process information about their customers. And we look across the set of competencies that are underneath this broader domain of digital leadership. We've identified key constructs such as leading with digitalization, adaptability, driving execution, hyper collaboration, so interacting with others through the use of digital technologies, and a concept we call 360-degree thinking, which is integrating all of that information into the use of decisions and making decisions about yourself, about your customers, and about your employees. So when we integrate all those views together, we come up with an overall state of readiness for organizations. So those organizations that have leaders in place with a higher degree of digital proficiency across those competencies. And those are the ones that we're calling digital pioneers. So one of the analyses we ran in this research was to understand, are these companies truly outperforming their competitors? We know that there's great attention given to digital proficiency, but we feel this was one of the first research studies that allowed us to truly demonstrate whether there was in fact a link to more successful organizational performance. And in this case, as you see on the screen, there of course was. So we found that those companies that were classified as digital pioneers, so those whose leaders on the whole were more adept at integrating digital technologies into the way that they lead others. So not just digital technology at a personal level, but digital technology as it shapes someone's role as a leader. They were outperforming others on this financial composite by 50%. So a huge digital payoff there as a result of those investments that they've made in growing their leaders and making use of these digital technologies. On the other side, those that are falling behind their peers, and of course, unfortunately, there are many here that fall into this category, the laggards, they were underperforming the average by 28%. So digital leadership is one key foundational set of capabilities that we did see a direct link to financial performance. So stepping to another key focus for the research, which is the identification and instilling in an organization of leadership purpose. And What's important about this definition is this is more than just a purpose statement. Many organizations have purpose statements, they have vision statements, but this is going on a purpose statement to actually be a truly purposeful organization. We're defining this as organizations whose leaders actually embody purpose and have actually changed their behaviors as a result of this. They actually lead others differently, they coach others differently, they delegate differently with this purpose mindset in place. So more than just a slogan, this actually shapes the way that they guide the behaviors of others. And when this is in place, you see a similar trend to the use of digital technologies. So the companies that on the whole had more of a purposeful focus for their leaders, they were outperforming the overall market by 42%. So a similar rate of advancement and outperformance as we saw with digital technologies. Those on the other side who really might have just have a purpose statement in place or perhaps don't even have that underway or underperforming the market. So we felt this was another key feature of the research to show a relatively under-investigated link between the use of purpose and the different levels of purpose, particularly the leaders in leadership who truly embodies purpose, actually brings that to life in their interactions, how this truly does have a financial payoff. We've also focused for many years on the impact of gender diversity on organizational performance. This is something we've looked at across the course of our research, find out not just whether gender diversity impacted organizational performance, but some of the reasons why that's actually the case. And we were able to extend this research into this current version to show the link between higher levels of gender diversity in leadership. As Rebecca mentioned, that is something that many organizations struggle with, and it's quite variable across the globe. And we're able to look at the organizations who have truly pulled in a more balanced group of leaders at all levels in their organizations, also into their high potential pools. And we found that the underpinnings of this are really about embedding inclusiveness within culture. So moving beyond stated policies actually to the behaviors and actions and the ways that leaders are working with others, the ways they're making decisions, the use of more objective tools rather than relying on subjective processes for making decisions, which often leads to bias creeping into those decisions. We feel that it's more about mindsets than skill sets. So the mindsets that underlie diversity and truly valuing the power of those perspectives, particularly from a gender diversity perspective. We're also finding that it's not just a matter of skill differences, but it's actually the way in which organizations think about the value of diversity that has this financial payoff. This also plays out in terms of the development planning activities they're putting in place, taking a more individualized, tailored, personalized approach to development planning, and also having more regular conversations with their leaders about what they need to become successful, rather than relying on outdated or stereotypes about what a leader is going to need to be successful. Next topic is one that's a favorite of mine. It's been a focus of our research for many years, and it's actually one of the more surprising findings in the research overall, looking at the use, adoption, and success rates with people analytics. And what surprised us was actually just how little progress many organizations had made towards advancement in the use of analytics applied to people data. You've all seen, and we've seen, the steady drumbeat of recommendations made to HR professionals and businesses more broadly on the use of analytics within their operations. This is something we've had the opportunity to track over time, and in fact, we've seen a step backward in many cases in success rates of these forms of analytics. Probably a number of reasons for that. I think HR professionals often struggle to build and grow in their own skills to provide analytics that the remainder of the organization, who in some cases has been performing analytics with their businesses for several years, many years. I think of operations, finance, sales functions. HR tends to be a bit behind the curve there with their own adoption of analytics. These are more complex data in many cases that HR professionals need to gather. There are other issues related to data security and privacy that also impact the use of data. So turning to the financial impact, and that's what you see at the bottom section of this chart. These are the specific areas of analytics, the specific analytical practices that we've found who have a stronger link, in particular, to financial outcomes. And what we found was that organizations, particularly that create leadership planning models, so projecting not just the leaders that are in place now, not just a looking backward view of the need for talent, but aligning leadership planning with broader strategic planning for the organization. What are the leadership requirements that are needed? How are competencies being redefined and how to put those in place in processes? All that derives from a more future-focused leadership planning model. This may also fold in scenario planning for alternative strategies that the business could take and aligning leadership planning against those alternative strategies to pick the best option. We also find that organizations that gather results metrics are more likely to be financially successful. So when you think of some of the historical metrics that are often gathered about HR programs, many of them stop with a more reaction-based view. And certainly that's important. We need to understand that participants react well to leadership programs. That's a key prerequisite to anything they're going to do with those programs back on the job, any of those learnings that they've received. But the organizations who truly see financial impact of the use of analytics are actually gathering more results-oriented metrics, and in many cases often more business-centric set of metrics about the outcomes of talent programs.
Evan,
We've also
just before we kind of move along, can I just stop for a second? I know you and I've often presented different elements of this report, and I just wanted to pick up on something you said earlier, which is the surprising, shocking, and perhaps sobering assessment of what people just don't seem to focus on in terms of what you and I might think of the basics. You know, the kinds of things like having the ability to understand the relative quality of your overall leadership cadre at any given time, to have individual leadership development programs, to use metrics in the selection of high potentials, for example, to use metrics to assess the effectiveness of your programs. It's just, do you find that perhaps also with your clients? I mean, just amazing that that's not just simply done?
Absolutely, yeah, that's a great example of common sense not equating to common practice, unfortunately. And I think as HR professionals as they struggle with budget, as they struggle with tight resources, it leads them feeling very stretched to determine how best to prioritize across a long list of wish list items for practices to put in place. As a result, many are struggling with the basics, much less some of the more advanced capabilities and practices to put in place. And as we look across the report, I know you and I had these conversations throughout the research. You can see the impact of analytics just really dripping out of every element of the report in terms of something that was not only a practice that linked to outcomes, but also one that that organization struggled with much more than we would expect. So whether it be analytics around high potential programs, analytics about development planning, particularly any form of analytics that are more sophisticated and prescriptive in nature, those just weren't in place despite being a heavy focus for many HR professionals over the past several years.
Yeah, I mean, even to things like asking leaders who indicated that they felt that they learned more from their employees about how to be a good leader than they did from their own, leaders or their own boss, or asking them to mentor others, and most of them indicated they never had a mentor. So, it's difficult for us to ask leaders to replicate good leadership behavior when they haven't seen it, and when organizations, as we found in this report, generally speaking, don't hold people accountable for being a good leader, for stemming retention, for attrition, for increasing engagement, for judging a leader by the number of leaders he or she creates. So anyway, I didn't mean to take us off track, but I just wanted to underscore that point that it's great that we can articulate the impact that doing these things can have, but the underlying belief is you must do these things in order to measure them. So, I think that you got to do them, you got to put them in place, and then you can measure and hopefully move your organization forward. So.
Absolutely, and I think your point's exactly right in terms of without measurement, it's impossible to gauge progress. It's impossible to know of a baseline. Measurement, data, analytics, all of that is foundational to objective decision making that helps work against bias and reduce the influence of diverse perspectives. And it has a true impact on being able to understand how employees view about their leaders. Leaders are often notorious for their blind spots about how they're doing on their jobs. They can easily convince themselves of one thing when in fact their employees feel another. Also, the transparency that exists for organizations. All of that is driven and often escalated by a more sophisticated use of information and data. So it's about the use of analytics for people reasons, but it goes much broader than that. All the various impacts that stem from the effective and well-planned use of data to better understand your employees, your customers, and taking action on that with you. And just one more practice to include here is a relatively new form of analytics, which is the use of storytelling techniques and also data visualization and how information is represented out to broader audiences. This is a critical skill area and an emerging skill area, although most don't have this in their skill set right now. But this is a rapidly growing focus area for many HR professionals. That's part of the buy-in and engagement that comes from the use of analytics information. Not just about processing that information; it's about explaining, communicating what you've learned from that information. That's the area where techniques to visualize and represent data in a way that broad audiences can easily see the key takeaways, as well as using storytelling techniques, pulling that in from other areas of business, even more broadly, the broader use of storytelling from fiction and applying some of those same techniques to the use of analytics. That too is one of the most critical practices linked to financial impact for analytics.
Evan, I'm glad to hear you say that because I don't think that's as widely understood in our profession, that this data visualization and storytelling is critical. It's one thing to have things to measure, which we've touched on. It's another to be able to measure them. And then there's also, you need to tell the good story. So, I think if our profession has an area where we can shine, it's usually in being able to craft a narrative. And being able to craft a narrative with the underlying data that makes a compelling argument could be very, very powerful. So I think that's just an element of this whole process that our profession can embrace and run with.
Absolutely. And we've also seen that through some of our research looking at who some of the most natural partners are for the HR profession. And so we identify the financial discipline as one area that HR can continue to improve its partnerships with, explaining its outcomes in financial and business-centric terms. But we've also found that marketing groups have a natural skill set that complements those for HR, and in a group that HR can very effectively partner with to not just tell the story, but really sell the story through some of those more compelling messaging techniques such as storytelling and visualization. All right, so just to look across the research at an overall model of financial impact. So there are some direct links here. So we found throughout the research a direct link between higher quality programs and bench strength. So bench strength is really the key intermediary in this model. So before you get to financial performance, first you improve the quality of your leaders, both now and in our research, we look at the next 3 years out. So who's prepared to step into those roles as others either move into new roles inside or outside the company? What is that bench strength equation, and what are the factors that drive that? So program quality ultimately builds up that next generation of leaders. However, there's a key moderating factor there. So those links are only in place if the organizations have effective practices in place. And we've talked about some of those over the last few slides, and we'll delve into a few more here in the next section. And then analytics. Analytics truly is an accelerator of other practices. It makes good practices better. It makes the investments you're making in other leadership practices, whether it be new development planning systems, new training courses, it provides a higher ROI of those programs when analytics are in place. And it's for the reasons that Rebecca mentioned. Without that information, it's very hard to know certainly whether a program had an impact, but more importantly, why it had an impact, or perhaps why it didn't have an impact. And what are the ways that the organizations can gather this information early enough to make course corrections to the use of those programs before the money becomes misspent, and finding ways to make sure that organizations are getting the most value from their talent investments. So we have a section in the report, and candidly, it's my favorite section of the report actually, because it provides a very in-depth summary across a range of different practices. And Rebecca and I will go through 4 sets of these practices here. So what this scoreboard does is it looks at 38 specific practices that are in place or not for many organizations, and it indicates how often this practice is in place. So on the whole, how often are these practices done? And I suspect that you'll see some surprises here already in cases where something that seems very obvious and very straightforward in several cases, most organizations, the majority of organizations aren't doing these practices. But then we also show links between the use of these practices and program quality, also bench strength, so that future set of leaders that are in place to fill critical positions over the next 3 years, and then financial performance. And we'll focus today on the specific practices that are linked to financial performance, some of the common threads of what that tells us about some of the key themes that we feel are driving these higher levels of financial performance. So in this case, you'll see a few practices that have those links. So the filled-in dot indicates a strong relationship. The empty dot indicates a moderate but still significant relationship. So in this case, you see some links between fair and objective talent planning tools, up-to-date status of talent in the organization, so knowing the state of your current group of leaders, both now and looking into the future. Then also formal mentoring programs as a key area with a strong or direct impact, as well as some other effects here that drive from broader talent management practices across the organization. So these are often foundational practices that HR has in place, not just for leaders, but impacting the broader group of employees. We'll come back to some common themes here. Also looking at performance management. So this was a relatively new area of focus for us, given all the tension and pressure that's existed around the use of different performance management systems, whether or not to use ratings. And an interesting one, because we actually did find that the elimination of ratings and performance management practices did have a stronger link to financial performance. So the more financially successful organizations were more likely to have abandoned a rating-centric process for performance management. As we looked into this further, we found that it's perhaps not surprisingly, it's not just about the abandonment of those practices, but it's what replaces those practices. So organizations that move away from a heavy focus on ratings in performance discussion, those are replaced by discussions about development, discussions about growth aspirations, discussions about career pathing. And for leaders experiencing those practices, those have a strong impact on their willingness to stay with the organization, their long-term commitment to the organization. And again, we are seeing the connection there from those practices and the use of a more development and discussion-focused form of performance management. We're seeing some payoffs there to the financial outcomes for these same organizations. So summarizing across these different success factors, so looking across talent management, performance management, what are some of the common threads that we've seen extending across these practices, specifically with a lens towards financial payoff? So this starts with fairness, objectivity, and transparency. Several links here. And this really, we also connect this to explainability of decisions made about leaders. And the other area where explainability is also playing a strong role is with the use and adoption of AI, artificial intelligence, and many organizations recognizing that it's not enough for those AI systems to just be predictive. They also need to be explainable, because when you're dealing with people, those people are going to have justifiable questions about why decisions were made. So the transparency that come from these approaches do have this stronger link to financial outcomes. We think explainability is a key component to that. We also saw several links between definitions of effectiveness that are clear. So it's something that everyone understands when they have their performance discussions with their own manager, as they look to make decisions about how they need to better grow as a leader. That's all based in a clear definition of what makes leaders effective. Also current definitions. So we found that organizations that have more recently revised their competency models, they're more able to pull in updated definitions about interaction skills, for example, that take into account that many of those interactions are now occurring remotely or virtually. And then having a competency-based definition of effectiveness allows organizations to take an abstract concept like adaptability and translate that into specific skills and behaviors that leaders need to focus on to become successful. We also saw several links between the use of diagnostic tools to drive development. Historically, diagnostic tools have been used primarily to make hiring and promotion decisions, but increasingly those are getting pulled in as ways to better understand leaders that then fuel more personalized, tailored, and ultimately more effective leadership development programs, which again are also linked to these financial payoffs. We found that organizations who don't leave processes to chance, that many view as optional or informal, but they actually take a more formal approach to mentoring programs. That was one of the stronger links we saw in the research. The use of formal programs to plan key transitions, so from one leadership role to another, from one department to another. Organizations who understand the challenges associated with those transitions, set the right expectations not only for the leader's old manager, for the leader's new manager. Those that formalize those processes are more likely to be financially successful. And then also how organizations make key decisions, and these decisions can add up in their costs and success rates, but also the cost of failure very quickly with global assignments. So those who are put into expatriate programs, also not leaving that to chance, but having formal programs to prepare leaders to make those key global transitions. And then performance discussions, prioritizing those over performance ratings. The ratings themselves, the abolishment of ratings was linked to financial performance. We think this is because of what's actually replacing those ratings and leading to a more developmentally growth an individualized discussion rather than a more rote and basic ratings process. I'm going to turn this back to my partner Rebecca for the next set of practices and their implications and links to financial outcomes.
Well, terrific. You know, Evan, when I think about some of the things that you've shared, it's always amazing to me that sometimes the simple building blocks that you would hope are in place are quite often missing. So I want to maybe save some of the conversation around the points that you've made for the question and answer session we have just ahead of us, and encourage people to enter their questions in below. But let me take us through the last couple of prepared slides, and then we'll open the place up for questions. So I'm going to touch on high potential practices. So the one here that we would highlight is that high potential leaders are told and aware of their special status. Now, 59% of the respondents said that that was a practice that they used, and that's strongly linked to financial performance. My question, of course, is why aren't the other 41% doing that? And, you know, I think we could have several conversations around the pros and cons of that. But I think human beings, particularly people who are fairly, you know, well along in their career and have a sense of organizational practices, pretty much figure out whether or not they're a high potential or not. And others pretty much figure out who's the high potential here. They see who has access to opportunities or who gets tapped for, you know, task force work, or who has exposure to senior leadership, or a variety of other things. So, you know, I would question why people don't. If we know that it's linked to higher levels of performance, particularly financial performance, why wouldn't you do this? And so I'd love to just toss that question out to the group, and maybe that's something that people also have questions around. But why wouldn't you tell someone, you know, we think a great deal of you, and we believe that your contribution will continue to grow. You know, and maybe you don't even use the word high potential, because remember, you know, being designated a high potential is a snapshot in time. It's not a tattoo. And so what you'd want to do is to help people understand that while we have every expectation that they'll continue to do well, they do need to show that they are worthy sort of the increased attention and opportunities that's going to be afforded to them. And so, you know, I'd be curious to know what folks think in terms of why wouldn't you say this, right? Another area here, in fact, I think what we've done is we've missed an opportunity also to talk about things in terms of development. So here's a couple more. So you see the first one, there's really four that I want to highlight that have a link to financial performance. And as Evan shared, you know, this is directly related if it's a solid dot, and still significantly related, but not quite as concretely if it's open. So 61% of people are using the methodology of having leaders practice and receive feedback on key skills from their managers. Okay, so let's just go through this slowly. This is a leadership development program that you're putting together, and 61% of people, meaning 39% do not, have leaders practice and receive feedback on skills with their managers. I'll just let you marinate with that for a moment. Here's another one. Only 47% of people have leaders regularly review their development plans with their managers. And this is also in line with many of the other elements of the report where we know that managers are not held accountable for the development of other leaders. I think that's a critical missed opportunity. Another one is that only 45%, I'm going to read this slowly because it's hard to believe, only 45% have leadership development modules that are positioned with leaders as a planned sequence, i.e. some method to the madness, rather than independent events. Hard to believe. And here's another one. Only 37% of people indicated that they have as a regular part of their process a dedicated learning experience manager, could be a chief talent officer or someone in his or her team, who designs and sequences personalized, engaging learning for leaders. Now this assumes, and you must be coming from a place where you say, well, all leaders need the following 12 things and we're going to sheep dip them the same way. For those of you who are outside the United States or outside of New England, that may not resonate for you, but it's a process where everybody gets the same thing, they get dipped into the same, flea-killing substance, and then they get moved along the food chain. And so the question I would have is, you need to look at leaders in terms of who they are and where they show up, and then develop personalized, sequenced, tailored experiences just for them. But only 37% are doing it. So those were just some of the things that we found that had a direct correlation to financial performance. But for those of you who are ROI certified, and maybe it's partly because I've done enough books now with Jack and Patty Phillips that I feel a need to kind of show you some of the data here as we do the closeout on this, is that purposeful companies, as Evan mentioned earlier, those with active leadership support outperform the market by 42%. And for those of you who download a copy of the report, I put in exactly where this comes from. There's a performance premium on digital leadership, and the ones with the strongest digital leadership capacities, the pioneers, they outperform on a composite of financial metrics by 50%. And lastly, I'd share these 2 points of data. Organizations that extend their development of high potentials well below, so moving further down into the leadership cadre, are 4.2 times more likely to outperform those that don't on a financial composite of financial metrics. You've got to think about high potentials well below just those that you think are going to go into the most senior positions. It really needs to be earlier in career with a broader, more diverse net.
And that's such an important point to touch on, Rebecca, because that's a fundamental change in how organizations think of high potential talent. So moving from the select few, a very elite group, to something that's a much broader and more inclusive view of potential that has links to use of diverse perspectives and better incorporation of diverse individuals from demographic backgrounds, but also from functional backgrounds, and not thinking of this as you automatically need to have spent time in the sales organization before you can be considered a high potential. It involves thinking about international assignments, and if international assignments are something that aren't a good fit for everyone, and in some cases those disadvantage certain groups of candidates, moving away from that as an implied assumption that exists when developing high potentials. It also involves, in many cases, putting in place new tools that are more scalable to seek talent much more broadly across the full pipeline. So just a bit to elaborate on that as really one of the biggest takeaways, I think, from the use and reframing and more fundamental differences in how organizations are thinking about practice, thinking about potential, and we're seeing that pay off for the organizations who are thinking more progressively about those topics.
Yeah, no, I think you often make this point, Evan, is the potential pool swells to a lake, right? And, you just need a much bigger group of people because, leadership development is a little bit like projecting the the trajectory of a hurricane or a cyclone, right? So for a long time, you have that sort of cone of uncertainty. You're not really sure where it's going to hit. And certainly it gets clearer as you get closer to it. But by the time you have to start developing leaders, you're making an educated guess as to where you think the organization will be in 3 to 5 years, what kind of leaders you will need, and then what kind of developmental opportunities will these folks need to be ready to execute on the vision of the future you think is out there. You miss that
Absolutely.
by a degree or two, and it's tough. You'll have the hurricane landing in a whole different part of the country.
Mhm.
So
Very true.
I think that's critically important to point out. Yeah. The other thing is, people may come and go, and you cannot bet the ranch. How many times, maybe speaking to the choir here, folks on the phone, but you've inherited a succession plan process from someone as enter a new company, and the same really, really, really talented individual is in 7 boxes as the replacement for those 7 critical roles. I hope that they have a really good compensation and retention package in place, because otherwise there's a world of hurt coming. This last point here, then we'll open it up to some questions. Take a look at how much the estimate is on how much is spent each year on a high potential. And, it ranges on average about $4,000 per person per year. And if the success rate for high potential leaders is only 61%, then not getting this right represents a great deal of money. And this is just in the U.S. alone. So, I think if you're looking for data to support the work that you're doing, here it is. But I think the other thing that I would stress is that without the ability to articulate what is done and done well, to Evan's point, you'll never know how to improve because you don't understand sort of where you are, where you need to go. But I know I'm talking to the choir here. So, Evan, anything to add before we start down the questions that some people have shared with us?
I don't think so. I'd say let's dig into the questions and get into that phase of the dialogue.
Okay, then. Here's the first question. It says, could you please differentiate high, I guess it's high potential?
Was it high? I think high performers from high potential.
Okay, I'm sorry. This seems to have been cut off. Here we go. So here we go. Thank you. I'm getting a little help from the broadcast booth. Thank you. So could you please differentiate the high performers from high potentials? So Evan, do you want to take a stab at that?
Sure. So at DDI, and I know the conference board certainly has a wealth of position and research on this as well. We do define high potentials using a different framework, looking at some of the personality attributes that become more critical at higher level roles and allowing us to gauge attributes such as perhaps resilient or advancement motivation that do start to distinguish a bit between those that are high performers in their current job, but might lack some of the motivation or potentially have some of the personality derailers in place that might not be hurting them in this role, but might be something that impedes their performance in the next role. So certainly there's an overlap there, and that's of course the classic 9-box view is that there are some that they sync up their performance and potential very well, but we feel that without a view that is a bit differentiated around this longer term performance, looking at not just what a leader needs now, but what they're going to need going forward, including some areas that they might struggle with as they move into more advanced roles. And a great example is someone's ability and willingness to delegate. And there's going to be someone might be able to get along fairly well as a leader who still tends towards micromanagement of their group, but that's going to be absolutely impossible moving them into a VP level or something that approaches the executive suite. That level of micromanagement tendency simply isn't going to be possible. So I think it's the off diagonals there in that 9-box view that tend to be most insightful, and because of that, we do think it involves a different set of tools and frameworks for evaluating potential versus current performance. What would you add, Rebecca?
I would just say, I'm shocked really because who doesn't enjoy being micromanaged? I mean, let's be candid. It's so comforting. You never really have to think for yourself, and just it's a beautiful thing. We have a lot of questions, so I'm just going to go briefly through these, and then you just keep the questions coming. We'll answer as many as we can here. So we have a question on how do you hold managers accountable for nurturing leaders? What are the tactics to make that happen? So it's pretty simple. You either have a leader at the top, i.e. your CEO and his or her C-suite, who says that they're going to hold leaders accountable, or you're not. And if you do that, you simply make that part of the way which you evaluate the overall performance of a leader. So if you're looking at leadership qualities, certainly it's the ability to deliver results, but it's also how. It's also how many leaders have they developed? What's their attrition rate? What is their engagement or progress on the engagement scale? So you just make that part of the metric in which they're evaluated, because what you don't measure, you're not going to get. So that's the long and short of that one. But Evan, anything to add there?
I'm right there with you. As we've looked at those that are progressing through higher level assessments, we find a consistent trend where it's very clear that organizations are recognizing, rewarding, and giving opportunities to those who excel in the execution side of their jobs, but they're putting much less focus on their ability to engage others along the way. So you're left with a situation where others have hit the numbers by any means necessary, but they've left a trail of destruction in their wake, and that hasn't held them back. And it's about realigning that view of performance to incorporate the engagement side of the equation. I think that's a reinforcement of your perspective on what's necessary to build accountability to make this happen. Some of this is recognizing that reward systems can easily become askew and overly biased towards execution over engagement.
Yeah, it's always the what and the how. All right, here's the next question. It says, it's great to expand the pool, but it diffuses the investment dollars. Are you sure it's worth the trade-off? So you might have, remember Animal Farm that we all probably read in the 7th grade? All animals are equal, but some are more equal than others. So you still have the same pot of money to play with, probably, and you're going to make the most expensive bets where you think you need to. And sometimes things like mentoring don't cost nearly as much as it costs to, let's say, ship someone off to a third-party executive ed program, which are very good many times, but it depends on where you want to spend your dollars. So sometimes attention and money are two different things. And so just because you have a larger pool doesn't mean that the dollars are spread, you just divide by X number of people in the pool. And Evan, correct me if I'm wrong, but in the report, doesn't it show that time trumps money when you think about developing leaders?
Absolutely. I was just going to bring that up. So yeah, you're absolutely right. So we found that we measured both the hours spent on high potential development, so how many hours were people spending in these programs, and the dollars spent. And the hours spent had a 68% stronger relationship to leadership and business outcomes than the money spent. So I think I think that's a way of explaining how some of these practices that you can have a very efficient way to allocate investments, and in some cases it's about either some generalized practices, and as Rebecca mentioned, some of the communication around transparency about those who are in the pool that has a strong impact, but it's a relatively low financial investment, and how those investments are allocated and how time is spent versus money. So certainly there is a balance there, and neither are we allocating that there isn't and shouldn't be a differentiated investment. But I think there are some data in our research, and we've spoken about a few of these points today, that I think challenge the assumption that more money is always the best way to allocate towards higher impact and more successful high potential pools. In fact, we found that hours spent in leadership programs have a stronger payoff than dollars.
Yep. Thanks, Evan. So here's another question. It says that Ed says that I expressed amazement concerning why a greater number of organizations are not leveraging some of the key findings. It's not so much my amazement around that, Ed. It's my amazement that they don't get the basics right. So long before you get fancy, I think you have to put the building blocks in place. There are a lot of, honest to God, we held our head when we saw the results when we first came in. It was like, how can this be possible? The self-assessment, the self-reported assessment of their own effectiveness of the leadership programs that they put out there. They don't have, many of them didn't have a high potential program. And I think it's something like 65% of those who do say they're ineffective. So the question is, Why are you doing this over and over again if you in your own heart don't believe that it's effective? So that's my amazement piece. Not that they don't necessarily do the financials. That's difficult if you don't have the building blocks and you haven't gotten the data with which to assess right along. So that's where my amazement comes from. Here's another one. What do you see are the main blockers that stop or delay companies from implementing the success factors in their leadership strategy? Okay. Evan, you want to take that one?
Well, and I think it's undeniable that HR is under immense pressure, and I think we see the challenges with prioritizing amongst a long list of to-dos. I think there are elements of that HR can orient towards to improve its ability to better prioritize those lists. I think some of it is taking a more evidence approach to what's working and what truly is the right thing to do from a payoff perspective, not just financially, but in terms of bench strength, not just because it's a historical expectation of something that HR has done. I think of some of the trends towards process automation that have been adopted in other areas of the business that HR, unfortunately, is often a step or two behind. So HR is still beholden to and perhaps feels a bit anchored to some of the historical processes related to compliance or certain HR functions. And not all of those disappear, of course, but as HR has struggled to adopt technology and better use new digital tools in its own work, I think that's key to helping HR extricate a bit from some of the more historical functions to be able to better allocate resources and attention and growth towards some of these new practices. So I think it's a combination of knowing what works, but also what works better than others and where they could shift resources away from. I personally don't think that it's an issue of HR not knowing what their to-do list is. I think there's a few cases where HR may not have full awareness of some of the more valuable practices. I think it's as much about HR distancing itself from practices that are less effective, and in some cases, stop just because it's something that's historically been done for a decade. So aside from some of the pure compliance issues, I think it's an opportunity to question some of those practices that don't have the evidence-based link that others do as a way to reallocate investments within a very long to-do list towards those that have the strongest evidence base for their effectiveness.
Okay. Evan, thanks. I'm very conscious of the time, but I have a question here that I think you might want to address. It says, can you elaborate on how you tied company performance success to the level of effort / investment in leader development? Or is that the methodology section of the report that maybe is a better response?
Absolutely. So we had in the course of this research, we had three main data sources. We had data directly from leaders, so those are the 25,000 leaders that Rebecca mentioned. We had data from HR professionals, so that was the about 2,500 HR professionals from a little less than 2,500 organizations. And then we had the financial data, which was collected entirely independently. So we're able to align these data sources. Not every company, of course, is publicly traded or had this information available to them. I want to make a link that perhaps we didn't make explicit before, but we knew which leaders were associated with which organizations and which HR practices. So that allowed us to build out a model linking aggregate leader engagement or perceptions about the organization to the practices that organizations were following, and those are the ones that we put a heavy focus on today, such as up-to-date development planning as one example. And then we had an organizational level outcome of financial metrics. So we essentially had this three-step linkage process to connect these data together. We do have more on the methodology there in the report, but it's a good question because it helps clarify some of the key linkages that we were able to make between different data sources to justify some of our conclusions.
Great. Thanks, Evan. So we've got two last questions. I'm going to address them very quickly and then close out. So the question here is around, can seem overwhelming as to how to begin with this, and what are the first steps for someone who wants to begin moving effectively in this direction. Here's the great thing that I love about this report. I did not invent it, but it's something DDI has done consistently for a long time with these, even before we partnered with them on these. And that is what I love about this is you have 25 insights in this report. And so each two-page spread ends with, sort of a start here, and if you're already on the way, keep going. And so that they have very specific steps for your consideration as to where to begin or how to continue the journey. So I think you'll find that very helpful. So we have that for every single one of the findings in the report. And then the last question is the 2018 forecast report on the DDI website is this exact report that we're talking about. You'll see that the graphics match up, but the webinar title says 2019 forecast. So that's an error, and we will, of course, fire that person. So thank you for pointing that out, but this is the 2018 report that we're talking about. So let me just say that I so appreciate that, over 120 some odd people chose to spend some time here. And if you thought that this was helpful, I would encourage you to sign up for the remainder of the series. Up next on March 12th is an examination by one of our colleagues at EY, Susan Robinson, as well as Amy Abel from the conference board. We're going to talk about how women in leadership that have a strong cadre of women leaders are doing better in terms of business performance. So please do sign up and register for that webcast. I would mention to you also that we have a leadership development conference, because that's where you'll find more of your people talking about this particular kind of topic about leadership development. And that is in April and June here in New York, and would encourage you to attend. But if you are in the New York area later this month, there's a great talent management conference that's up, and that's on our website as well. I would encourage you to not miss out. We do that one twice a year as well. And so these were my favorite leadership development related conferences when I was a practitioner, and I'm not supposed to have favorites now, but if I did, these would be it. So let me just reiterate again my appreciation for your having joined us. And I would also extend a big thank you not only to the many hands who put these things together behind the scenes, but also my good partner, Evan Sinner. And it's always a pleasure to partner with you, Evan, in a variety of formats. And just thank you for your insights today. I thank everybody who joined. And Evan, any last thoughts?
No, this was a great session, and hopefully you'll have the opportunity to download the report and to join additional webcasts.
Outstanding. Thanks, everybody, and be well. Thanks, Evan.